everybody, and welcome to this panel session on the role of open source in AI development. We're delighted you've been able to join us here today, and thank you to colleagues at the AI House for hosting us. My name is Jess Montgomery. I'm Director of AI at CAM, which is the University of Cambridge's mission to create AI that serves science and society. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by our three panelists. So we have Yann LeCun, who's VP and Chief AI Scientist at Meta, Neil Lawrence, who's the DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Cambridge, and Bernhard Schölkopf, who's a professor at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems and ETH. So over the next half hour, we're going to be exploring the role of open source in AI innovation. As many of you will know, we're in the midst of a dynamic conversation about the role of open source and how to bridge between concerns about AI safety and our desire to share the benefits of AI innovation. Many policymakers across the world are grappling with these questions about how we facilitate the development of AI while preventing the rapid unconstrained proliferation of potentially dual-use technologies. Now, to start, I'd like us to give a few reflections on what we're talking about when we talk about openness in AI development. Now, this is a thing that means different things to different communities, ranging from publication of code, publication of model weights, publication of training data, through to licensing terms. So perhaps to start, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to say a few words on what they think open source means for AI. Yann, can we start with you on this?
Right. Well, I'm sure many of you were at the previous panel, so I'm going to repeat some of it, but perhaps not as much detail. So I think it's been very clear over the last year that open source platforms are accelerating progress. The progress that we're seeing based on open source AI systems has been faster than what we've seen in the commercial world. So there is no question that at some point the two curves will cross and open source will take over. This is a repeat of the history in operating system and software infrastructure for the internet that happened in the 1990s, where the entire internet nowadays runs on open source software. It wasn't to be the case in the mid-90s. It was a battle between Sun Microsystems and Microsoft. In the end, both of them lost, and open source platform became the standard. AI systems are going to become a common platform, and there is a huge incentive for society to use open platforms when that's the case. Infrastructure has to be open. And so there's no question that open source AI is happening and progressing really fast. Another reason it needs to happen is because we're not going to have a single AI system. We're going to have lots and lots of different AI systems that cater to different languages, cultures, value systems, centers of interest, and those are going to be trained and fine-tuned from foundation models. They're going to be fine-tuned for those particular interests, which will allow countries around the world or communities to have AI systems that cater to their interests and their values and their culture and their language. And that is not going to happen with proprietary platforms, built in the west coast of the US. So then there is the question of, is it dangerous to have open source platform? And should people who produce open source AI system be liable for whatever people do with the system? The answer is no. And the reason why we can say it's no is because I don't think there is any example of Linus Torvalds being sued because some deployment of Linux turned out to be insecure or unsafe. Okay? That responsibility is in the hands of people who use Linux in their product and then deploy their products. I think it should be the same for AI. If you deploy a product based on AI, you're liable for all the good or the bad that you can do. But the open source platform isn't. So, short story.
Neil, how would you respond to that?
So just actually going back to the previous panel, I think one of the things Max mentioned, who I think is also still here, the sort of history of the open source movement goes back to MIT, and I think it's, well, the founding myth that I know that I think is roughly correct is Richard Stallman was trying to control his printer and found he could no longer access the printer driver and sort of launched the Free Software Foundation, free as in democracy, not beer. I sometimes get that the wrong way around. Now, but I think that we need to take a big step back from that movement, which is a really important movement and has driven a lot, as Yann has hinted out, and think about what does open development look like now? Because back in those days, like the source code was everything. So by opening the source code, I was sharing the full pipeline of innovation, and it was hinted at previous panel. That isn't true anymore. But I think also I'm not as confident as Yann that open source is going to dominate. And I think a world where it doesn't is very it's very worrying for the following reason. So when I was 4, I kind of thought the world was run by people like the Prime Minister, and that they sort of said how things should happen, and those things happened. And that was how things progressed, and there were people in charge who knew how things worked. Now, somewhere between the age of 4 and the age of 51, I worked out it doesn't quite work like that. Sylvie Delacroix, who's in the audience, has many times recommended that I read The Open Society and Its Enemies by Popper, which is all about how liberal democracies have institutions, and it's those institutions that underpin society. And we've already seen those institutions under threat by technology. And the thing that I worry about is the following thing. I'm horrified by the extent to which we are looking at people who are deploying these technologies and have little understanding of their impact at the moment to lead the international debate on regulation. And the closest analogy I can think of is the sorcerer's apprentice. You've got the situation where Sam Altman, in the role of the sorcerer's apprentice, is deploying the spell, having it tidy up, standing back and saying, what a wonderful job I'm doing, and having no ability to control it. And instead of the rest of the society saying, actually, that's institutional, that's the responsibility of our governments, our institutions, our legal professions, our accountancy, our medical professions to step in and do that, we're saying, and tell us the fix as well. This is an enormous problem. And the depth of the problem is the following. All of these professions emerge from the invention of writing. So this is a clay tablet. Well, it's a 3D printout of a clay tablet from Mesopotamia. All those professions, accountants, law, civil administration, comes from people who controlled access to writing, controlled the information infrastructure. We have created a world where the information infrastructure is controlled by large tech companies who are not under proper regulatory supervision, who claim they can control that structure, and again and again and again have shown that they can't. And the only route we have is to re-empower those institutions, the people that can keep us protected from the enemies of the open society. And the only way we can do that is through open development. Now, whether that looks exactly like the current open source infrastructure, I mean, there's a number of initiatives we're launching this week which will aim to address that, and whether we need to reimagine what that open development infrastructure looks like. The key point is we need to re-empower the civil servants, the lawyers, the accountants, the doctors with an understanding and a capability to wield these technologies like they were able to wield the previous generation of information infrastructure. Apologies, I went on too long, so I'll stop there.
So Bernhard, what are we talking about when we talk about open source?
So open source, open development, we're already in the middle of the discussion. I was going to start a little bit more basic, coming back to your question. So I think a lot of people in the general audience don't know how great that is as a concept, so that people work together, share their work very openly, are open to scrutiny, build on other people's works in a much more efficient way than is traditionally the case in sciences. If we ask ourselves, why did this happen in computer science? Why is it possible at all? And I think a lot has to do that computer science deals with information. So, I mean, I think you're all familiar with this notion of the tragedy of the commons. You have a common resource, people are trying to access it, and then there's an incentive that you take too much for yourself, you take it away from other people. Now, the amazing thing about information that we are dealing with in computer science is that it can be essentially copied at no cost. So you can give something away, and you still have it yourself as well. And if you give it away, then you might have some benefits. Maybe the other people will also give it away. Maybe they will find bugs. Maybe they will build on it. Maybe they will expand the reach of your work, etc. So first of all, I think it's a great model that maybe could work in other spaces in society as well. It's a good thing, a priori. And of course, there have been also people have put forward the same argument in AI. And I remember I think you were also part of this 15 years ago. We wrote a paper about the need for open source in machine learning, and of course it was already obvious. I mean, we knew that in computer science it's important. It's also important in machine learning. There are some aspects that are a little bit different. I think we might cover that later, like training data and things like that. So in now the field has changed, of course, obviously. That's why we're here talking about AI at the World Economic Forum. Large companies have entered the stage. Some of those companies initially started very much building on open source software, arguing that this has to be an open development, even put it in the name of the company. And then later, the argument somehow turned around and people started saying, well, it turns out that what we're building seems to be so powerful that it shouldn't be open anymore. And maybe one can follow this argument to a certain extent. But then when the conclusion of this argument is that since it's so dangerous, we should control it, then I ask myself, well, then what gives you the right to be the ones that control it? If it's really true that it's as powerful as you make us believe it is, how come you have the right to control it? So I think this is now going in the direction of what Neil has been saying. Maybe I should leave it at this, and then we see how the discussion develops.
Well, maybe pulling on this thread that's come through contributions so far about the tension between openness and safety. As Bernhard has mentioned, the field has changed a huge amount over the last 10 years. AI is now both a fast-moving technology area and one deployed at scale that is affecting individuals, communities, society in different ways. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a range of ways in which AI is harming society. We've seen those tangible harms already. And if we look at the declaration from last year's Bletchley Summit, that talked about the actors developing AI or potentially harmful AI systems having a strong responsibility for the safety of those systems. So where does safety then come into this conversation? What does responsible AI R&D look like? Can it be done openly whilst integrating concerns about safety, or should we be looking to other domains to give us those levers?
So I think current technology, like safer AI, will not arrive by working on AI safety. It will arrive by working on better AI. It's a little similar to what's happened over the last 20 years in speech recognition, where there were people working on robustness of speech recognition, because speech recognition was working well for like well-pronounced English by adults, and it didn't work for people with accents and for kids and blah, 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 right? And noisy signals. And so there were people who were just kind of focusing on making speech recognition more robust. Nothing ever came out of it. What makes speech recognition better is just better speech recognizers, right? Changing the basic technology that speech recognition uses. Instead of using hidden Markov models, they started using neural nets, and basically that's what solved the problem. So it's going to be the same thing for AI. I don't think much is going to come out of research in AI safety that is going to attempt to make AI safer. What's going to happen is AI research that is going to come up with better architectures that are intrinsically safer than the current systems that we have. So autoregressive LLMs, and people have hated me for this, but autoregressive LLMs are intrinsically unsafe. There is no way to make them safe. They're still useful, okay? It's fine. They're not super intelligent, and you can kind of mitigate the dangers if there are any, and the dangers are not that great anyway, so it doesn't matter. It's okay. The dangers, I think, have been overemphasized and magnified for no reason. But they are intrinsically unsafe. We're not going to solve hallucination problems and jailbreaking with the current architecture of autoregressive LLM. We have to come up with better AI. What does that mean? AI that is goal-driven or objective-driven, as I've described on a couple of occasions. And it's a completely different architecture than the current ones we have. So that's how we're going to get safe AI, not by working on AI safety. Now, how do you make AI systems safe, and where do you have to decide whether it's safe or not? It's at the product level. So when you deploy a system, you make it in the hands, you put it in the hands of a lot of people. It has to be safe. Like you use a system that, stops your car automatically if there is an obstacle in front of it, or drives it on the highway. Of course, there has to be some certification process. Or it's an AI system that's used in healthcare. There's got to be clinical trials and everything. So, and those regulations already exist to a large extent. And, there is an area where AI has been used extensively for which there was no regulation, and that's social networks. So it's the kind of stuff that you're talking about, Neil. And and why wasn't there any regulation in social network? And the answer is because no government could come up with a good way of doing it. Several years ago, Facebook went around governments of liberal democracies and asked them, tell us what constitutes acceptable content on social networks, because we don't have legitimacy to decide this for the rest of society. The answer was crickets. The Trump administration said, we have the First Amendment here, go away.
Cricket, the English game.
Right. No, the creepy animals.
Oh, crickets, no. Right.
The creepy animal you hear when nobody is speaking.
Oh.
It's an American expression, you wouldn't understand.
Hey!
But if we can maybe pick up on that thread of needing better AI, and isn't that a slightly risky approach? I mean, we've had the field of AI give us fantastic developments and applications, but it's also given us a lot of issues. Should we really be sitting back and saying, okay, well, research community, go away, do more, give us better AI? Neil?
I think that there's multiple things going on here. And actually, I think it's Ramaya in a previous panel talked about the importance between development and deployment from NIST, and it's so great. You've got organizations like NIST taking this very, very seriously. The problem with the Bletchley statement is you've got a group of people that had been freaked out by a promise of artificial general intelligence. Now, I want to back away from that, and let's make one thing very clear. The term general intelligence is a eugenic term. It's a eugenic term developed by people who were trying to prove that you could rank people and select them for their intelligence. There's an entire history to it. It's associated with Galton and Pearson, and horrible things happen. Yann already made this point beautifully. Human intelligence is multifaceted. You can't rank intelligence in that way. There is no sense in the term superintelligence because you can't talk about dominating humans in every respect, because what human intelligence is entirely subjective to what we are, right? So let's just be very clear. If you say artificial general intelligence, you are talking about something that eugenicists invented, right? So let's just move that to the side and talk about the actual problems we face, which is that we are building highly capable devices that do things much better than human beings do. Now, unfortunately, the Bletchley conversation got totally taken over by this notion that we're going to create this thing and it's going to kill us all. And so then in that case, you want to worry about the people who are developing that thing. But as Ramaya was saying earlier in the NIST discussion, when it comes to what's going on in practice, it's the deployers. It's the deployers of these things that you need to work with, because they're the ones that understand the domain, they understand law, they understand accountancy, they understand medicine, they understand their country, they understand their culture, everything that Yann was saying. And the problem we face as a society is empowering those deployers, because what we have at the moment is we've got developers don't understand the deployment domain, so they create a product that's not fit for purpose. Those deployers have no way of coming back, whether they're accountants, lawyers, or whatever, or the government, the civil service. The reason there were crickets when you ask the governments is because governments don't run the world. The world is run by institutions of lawyers, accountants, medics. Governments are part of that, civil servants. And the reason that there were crickets is because those people aren't empowered with the answers because they've not been given the understanding of the capability. So this is the transformation we need to bring about. And it is existential. It's not existential in the sort of killer robots existential. It's existential that we are talking about a fundamental change in the information infrastructure, as Bernhard was saying, of our society. And in order to ensure that we are controlling that infrastructure in a way that we want, we need our existing institutions to be empowered and to evolve.
And in that context, Bernhard, what do you see as being the responsibilities of AI developers?
So there's this discussion, I think, that we are revolving around whether open sourcing things makes the world safer or less safe. And of course, every single one of us sort of has to take such decisions. Am I going to open source the next piece of code that I'm writing? And I can understand the arguments in both directions. But I think people who are often policymakers who think about it, they don't sufficiently take into account this immaterial nature of the work that we're producing. So what I talked about before, that this is the information. So I think it's, even though it might sound attractive to say this is, well, there's this analogy. Sometimes people say this, it's something similar to proliferation in nuclear arms. But there's a big difference when it comes to realizing this in practice. So if you can, for instance, you can try to, so if you want to enrich uranium, you need centrifuges, you need high-level technology. It's something that you can't do so easily secretly. It's something that needs a lot of physical skills. You have to build hardware for it. So you can slow down things in that space by working against proliferation. Now, in the AI space, you might be tempted to say, and I think we've touched this several times, so, and we as a community, we are also maybe feeding this myth that we are so close to super AI, and this is very powerful. There's a lot of economic interest in sort of inflating this balloon. So we are, on the one hand, as a community, we're convincing the politicians that this is all super powerful and therefore potentially dangerous. But at the same time, so we're benefiting as a community from this attention in some respects. There's also negative aspects of this, but let's say the community overall seems to benefit. Otherwise, why would we do this? But we're not really giving them the tools how to address it. And I believe the old tools don't work. So it would be totally unrealistic to say we can just keep these models secret. So we have to think about what are the new tools? How could we make the world safe? And I think then it makes sense to think about concrete examples. And this is something that probably not only concerns the AI community, but also other fields of computer science and society. So even within computer science, there's the field of security, the field of software engineering. All these fields are sort of coming closer together again now. Even you could argue computer science started from AI, but then it differentiated into all these different topics. So now we have security researchers looking at these kinds of things. And then if we ask ourselves, for instance, look at the Llama model and Llama V2, this is one of the most prominent open source model in LLMs now, has the fact that Meta decided to open source or to sort of partly open source Llama, has it made the world safer or more dangerous? So I tried to look a little bit into this. I'm not a security expert. I talked to some security experts. We have, in part of the Alice network, we have some top-level security AI people who are running a large European project called ELSA, studying this. And what they're telling me is, so far, that the balance seems to be on the positive side. So there are no really compelling examples, even though this gets amplified a lot in the press. There are no compelling examples of new exploits that have been found purely by AI, and especially not examples that you couldn't also, I mean, there's a lot of sharing. You could also go to Stack Overflow and learn how to program a virus, etc. So it looks like so far nothing too negative has happened in that space, but a lot of positive things. People have used AI to analyze threats. People have used the open sourced meta models to study how to attack LLMs, study vulnerabilities. So it seems, at least that's my impression, right now, full transparency is our only means to make the world safer in that respect. And also maybe to remove some of the hype. If we analyze these systems, we also find their shortcomings, not just the dangers, but also the shortcomings, and it will give us a more realistic perspective on things.
So we're looking for tools that give us safety, security, transparency, accountability, and innovation across a range of sectors. That's a wide range of demands, many of which will be in tension. And Neil, you were talking about the role of institutional interventions in helping shape the development of these technologies. What type of openness or what type of tool do you think would help distribute the benefits of AI more equitably?
I think it's a great question. I think that's where things get really tricky. And that's why this conversation is harder to have. When it comes to empowering these professions, and bear in mind, these professions emerged from people who could write first and then started using the writing for using the legal code and doing accountancy. This is a set of field contracts, and most cuneiform tablets are accountancy or legal rulings. these modern professions, and we've just seen it in the UK with this Horizon scandal, where you've got this combination of government institution, the post office, Fujitsu as a service provider for technology, and postmasters who were sent to jail for fraud due to a failed accounting system. And this is something that emerged in the 1990s. And there's a sort of dramatization, and one of the things that just sings through on the dramatization is how every lever of society who should have intervened was disempowered, because the law in the UK is currently of the form that computers should be considered reliable unless there's proof that they're not. So everyone just assumed that the computers had got it right, and people committed suicide. People's lives were ruined by a large-scale accounting system. We even know how to do accounting. So the problem was that the accountants, or not the accountants that they had access to, there are of course forensic accountants and technical lawyers, just didn't have an understanding of what could go wrong. Neither did our judiciary, neither did the government itself. And addressing that is really, really complicated and requires very, very large investment in re-education of those institutions. And you can see why the temptation is to sort of say, no, let's create a safety institute and let's put 100 million in that, because the cost of this is way much more than 100 million. And it's a cost of sort of working across the board with people to sort of empower the understanding. Now, what the understanding is and where the openness needs to be is another different question, because it's not the case that a lawyer or an accountant or whatever needs to know every aspect of how these things. They don't need to understand Yann's great work on convnets and be able to read that paper to do this stuff. They need to understand where these things work and where they fail, which means they need to be close to these things in practice and close to these things in deployment while that's going on. That means these systems need to be scrutinizable. And that means they need to be open in this way that the scrutiny can happen. Now, if we go full open source, that clearly works. But there are definitely issues you mentioned around security and issues that we should be cognizant of that means that maybe we can't go that way. So what you really want out of it is that level of openness where those professions feel that they are confident in making their judgment about whether the right things are happening in this system. Yeah.
Now, we have a couple of minutes left for questions from the audience. I see we have one here already. Maybe if we can take three and then panelists will respond. So 1, 2, and 3.
A question following up on Bernhard's point about Llama, which is version 2 not causing many problems. I think it's a very interesting example. Do you think of that being different if the code and the data for Llama 2 were released? Do you have a review on that? And maybe another point to bring up there is that relative to open source code, in the case of AI, there's a lot of capital fixed costs. And does that change the calculus for open source data and code versus the weights, model weights?
So you're talking about the training code and the training data? Okay, so the training data cannot be released for legal reasons. It has nothing to do with what Meta wants to do. It's all public data, but you can't give the list because that's just calling for lawsuits. And in fact, those lawsuits already exist. So until that issue is settled on the legal side, you're not going to see list of training data.
I guess there's something in between. It would still be possible to open source the instruction fine-tuning.
Instruction fine-tuning is open source, and it's mostly not done by Meta. I mean, it's mostly other people who have...
But my understanding is Meta has open sourced the raw model, the fine-tuned model, but not the fine-tuning data that you need to get from one to the other one, which would be interesting scientifically and would help us do additional studies. But I don't want to blame you guys because you're more open than many of the other ones. But it could be even more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it would make sense probably to release at least some of that data. This is, by the way, unbelievably expensive to do. But it's okay. I mean, training those base models is also expensive, but it's something that Meta has to do for its own internal needs, and there is no reason not to distribute it to other people. I mean, that's been the philosophy at Meta since day one, that most infrastructure code is open source.
Then how can open source work if you can't? Do you need like universities? Do you to cover those fixed costs? What's the right organizational form to produce open source in that case? Is it universities or other public funded initiatives?
Well, there's multiple levels, right? There is who collects the data. And then you have organizations like LeCun and things like this that try, attempt to provide completely open data that can be used for training-based models. There's probably going to be efforts to collect fine-tuning data. In fact, what I was suggesting early on in the discussion was to build an infrastructure so that local communities or groups of interest could actually fine-tune their own system and then possibly make the data available so that it can be reused for new models, right? But then there is the training of base models, and that's still very expensive, so that's not going to be done by a lot of different players, and there is no need for 50 of them. We need maybe 2 or 3 open source base models. You need to have some competition, right? So you have Llama 2, Mistral, Yi, and whatever. I mean, Yi is actually built on top of Llama 2, but you need a few, and people need to kind of build on top of this. And you're only going to have a handful because it's common infrastructure. It's like a highway. You're not going to build like 2 different highways to go from one city to another one. You only need one.
It's like Linux.
It's like Linux. There's only, there's several versions, but there is basically only one kernel.
I also have a question. Yann, you before said that you're sure that open source will prevail. And I'm just wondering, why do you think that will be the best quality models, and the others, whether you agree? Because in a sense, if the best models won't be open source, then it doesn't really matter that much how the open source looks, right? Because that's not going to be used that much.
I mean, there's 2 questions. There's a question of what is the performance of the base system, right? So if you compare the best open source system at the moment, they're a little bit below, GPT-4 or whatever, although they're progressing fast. But then if you take, for any particular application, a fine-tuned version of Llama 2 or Mistral or whatever, for any particular application, it might actually be better than GPT-4 because you enable the people who fine-tune it to train it the way they want, which they can't do with proprietary systems, right? So in the end, the system might have better performance. And we've seen this, certainly in the world of web servers and operating systems, that those systems end up being more secure and progress faster in terms of technology. When you compare, there's more Linux things running in this room right now than any other operating system, just because it's dominant in the smartphone market. And so, that's completely taken over the world, and it's not because, it's not because of market forces or because Windows is not as good or whatever, or Mac OS for that reason, or whatever comes out of Apple. But it's because there's just more eyeballs on the open source thing that makes it, more secure, and it progresses faster in many respects.
So I feel like both Bernhard and Neil would like to...
Maybe adding one point. So one question is, will the best model in the future be an open source model? The other question would be, do we want to make sure that it's an open source model? I think there are good reasons why we want to make sure it's open source. And one reason that hasn't been mentioned so far is CO2. Because we all know it's expensive to train these models and expensive to run these models. And if we find ways to save some of these expenses, we should strive to do so.
I'm not confident that open will dominate, and I'm deeply worried about it. And the reason is large-scale regulatory capture, that we've seen governments totally captured by the agendas of big tech companies. And a lot of the risks that have been pushed forward. And I don't think it's like a conspiracy. It's just convenient for everyone to say, stop worrying about the actual harms we're causing. Worry about existential.
Not all big techs, by the way.
Yeah, not all big tech, but it's a narrative that big tech is very behind. And most of the people who were engaged in this practice and engaged with advice before ChatGPT came along had a much saner set of advice around these things. Now, I'm trying to be cautious around what does open source look like, because I don't think it necessarily will look like there's a good definition of open source that we use today for talking about code, and what that's going to look like is sort of a big question. But I think that the thing that I'm really curious about, Yann already talked about this in the previous panel, we are in the 1925 of the jet era. I believe the probability that large compute is required to generate such high capability is approximately 0. Right? And at the moment that someone works out how to build these things with a much more reasonable compute and much less data, as Yann was talking about, is going to be like the dreadnought moment. If you don't know about the dreadnought moment, it's when the British Navy, that had a policy of maintaining a navy twice the size of everyone else's, built one battleship called the dreadnought that could sink any battleship afloat. And thereby they had a navy size of 1. And that set off a naval battle. between Germany that leads to the First World War, Battle of Jutland, because all of a sudden your advantage is gone. And there will be a dreadnought moment with these models. And it's clear that there's going to be, because so much of the regulation is foolishly focusing on compute and flops and things like this, which means the incentive to go and study ways of doing this more efficiently for state actors that are being denied access to the current forms of compute is enormous. And when that happens, that will spread extremely quickly. And as Yann sort of said before, it would be like the jet age looking back at the propeller age. So it's sort of not clear how all of that's going to pan out. And I'm not as confident as Yann is. I think there were a few moments around the internet where we were lucky where things went open, including IBM's choice to go for an open architecture around the PC, which meant that Linux had a platform to sit on. Whereas when we look at mobile phones, everyone's gone for kind of closed architectures, and there isn't an open architecture. So I'm not as confident as Yann. I think we need to agitate for it.
So can we take the final two questions together?
Sure. Thanks for this great conversation. I want to follow up on the first question, which I think is an important point, and that's the importance of data and code and the definition of openness. So I think Neil was it who used the term full transparency. And the idea that full transparency enables scrutiny and accountability and all these things, I think only comes when you have some visibility into the data. And I appreciate the legal challenges and so forth. And just to, I guess, pose this kind of a very simple question, in machine learning, when you evaluate, you have to think about the connection between the training set and the test set. Of course, if you train on something, then maybe your numbers will be inflated. So without any proper scrutiny of the training set, we don't even know what these numbers mean. And I think that's this shift that we've in machine learning community have taken, which is, I think, underappreciated there. And then one final kind of analogy, if you think about open source software. So open source software has advantage that you can actually read the source code, you can modify it, and that's a level of full transparency. I would say that the current open models that many of the open models we have is equivalent to releasing a binary. So you have these weights which are not intelligible. You can run it. You can fine tune. So it gives you a little bit more control, but you don't have the full benefits of open source. So some folks have been, including me, have been referring to these broadly as open models, or maybe more precisely open weights models, opposed to open source, which I think would demand a larger amount of transparency.
I guess I have a little bit more of a positive spin than Neil had there regarding the openness and government's take on that. When we developed, my lab developed Stable Diffusion, our concern was that we have a foundational technology in the future which would just rest on the shoulders of one or very, very few companies, called foundational for a reason, right? That everything that we do in society, business, and so on will rest on that. And our goal was evidently to democratize that, and we see with this technology like how broadly it actually scaled afterwards. Now, I see a demand in that direction long ago. You mentioned IBM very briefly. IBM and its relation to Intel. Intel is only Intel because AMD was there, although they don't like each other. But IBM, as far as I know, they learned it from the military that you always need to go for a second source, or ideally more than a second source. If you rely just on one for your foundational technology, that's not something that you need to do. I believe that governments hopefully will also learn that just relying on a single source there is probably no good. Open source is probably the broadest way that you can go. Now comes the question of mitigation and risk mitigation there. I think open source is not what it used to be like decades ago anymore, because we released, for instance, the source code, but releasing the model, we chose differently. I mean, there was a company who then took a little bit of a different spin on that, because you can get risk mitigation, telling people openly what you're doing there, how that works, but there is a mode, right? You need lots of compute to essentially put together the models, and with that, like Mistral, for instance, also does it, you can hold certain things back, but give researchers, for instance, academics, and also that those that do the red teaming, the opportunity to look into your system and check it. And I think it's a little bit like a closet, right? If you know people visiting you and they can open up your closet, and you better make sure that everything is kind of organized. If you know, like, it's closed source, like, you know how it might look like.
Any reflections from the panel to those contributions?
I mean, I think Percy is right in saying that we need new definition of what open means, because there is indeed the data, the training code, the base model weights, the inference code, and the fine-tuning code and the fine-tuning data. Right, that's a lot of things, and any of those things can be open, limited, open in limited ways, or closed. Like the more we open, I think the better. But there are legal hurdles at the moment. I mean, certainly, Stable Diffusion is very familiar with those issues at the moment. But so is OpenAI, and so is Meta, and everything. So what really constitutes like, is it copyright infringement to use publicly available data on the internet to train your model? Japan says, yeah, it's fine. It's not copyright infringement. You can do it. We're not going to sue you for it. Europe says there is a right to opt out, or at least that's the proposal. And in the US, as usual, everybody is suing everybody. Right?
So maybe to wrap up, if I could ask for a final reflection from each of our panelists. We've talked a lot throughout the morning about the role of policy in shaping the development of AI. What one thing do you think policymakers should be thinking about as they think about open source and the next phase of AI development? Yann,
don't regulate it out of existence. On the contrary, promote open source platforms, because for almost every country in the world, except perhaps the US, it's the only way to AI sovereignty or any kind of control over what type of information AI systems will percolate to citizens. Citizens will, people around the world are going to get their digital diet through AI systems, in the near future, through smart glasses or whatever. And so you want this to not be under the control of a single entity, commercial or even governmental, right? So that has to be diverse and open, for the same reason we have a free press, for the same reason that we have diverse media, for the same reason that we have crowdsourced Wikipedia. We need to have a diverse way of creating AI systems on top of foundation models that cater to local interests. So don't legislate this out of existence. If you do, you will have the same outcome as the Ottoman Empire, who banned the printing press. Okay, you can ask the Minister of AI of the UAE. He's here. He will tell you that story. He says, it was a huge mistake by the Muslim world to ban the printing press. It probably was a major cause of the decline of what was, 100 years before, the dominant culture in science and everything, right? All the stars in the sky have Arabic names, if you didn't know this. And, algebra and algorithm are both Arabic words. But that stopped in the 1500s because the West embraced literacy. That created a new Renaissance, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And the Ottoman Empire didn't, because they were worried about the risks, the dangers, the lack of control. So we're in the same situation with AI. AI could amplify human intelligence as a whole and bring in a new renaissance, right, by amplifying human intelligence. Or we could stop it and be like the Ottoman Empire.
So I think that's a great point for me to pick up on. I mean, everyone talks about the printing press. The printing press destabilized the information infrastructure of the era, which was that only Catholic monks could control the administration, the accountancy, and the legal system. It led to thousands, if not millions, of deaths to go through this process of loss of security of an existing ecosystem to a hoped-for outcome of the modern liberal democracies. Now, that's fine. Maybe that's something that we have to accept, but it's part and parcel of a revolutionary information infrastructure. And the reason that the Ottoman Empire would have banned it is because they're worried about security. Now, we sit here in Switzerland or in the United Kingdom or the United States with our privilege of relatively secure institutional governments that can maintain security and support democracy. That is not true of most of the world. And it is absolutely shocking the extent to which we are not taking into that account, because people in the rest of the world are already dying on the idea that, oh, there'll be a new renaissance, or, oh, it's fine, we'll just share information. This works out. Well, it takes 500 years for it to work out, right? So we just really cannot afford to take that type of blasé attitude towards this serious technology. And when it comes to like things around, you know, I think with the sort of more optimism from Percy and Bjorn, I think there is a lot of cause for optimism. I think it's just depressing how badly the UK has done on this, and from being in a position of being right at the leading edge of these discussions and how to empower the government, to shifting almost entirely to focusing on existential risks. So the advice for the question, which was, what should policymakers do? Number one, be very wary of all those policymakers who basically don't do much in their day job because it's difficult doing policy. But when someone comes along and says, well, AI is going to provide an existential threat, they go, oh, well, I'm going to move into that domain because that's the biggest, most important domain. So you just collect a bunch of people who were not able to do fundamental policy, were at a loose end, weren't doing anything that relevant, and suddenly converge around this new existential threat, and basically are the most non-functional people in government, and simultaneously are telling the rest of government, don't worry about the health sector, the education sector, all these problems that we know have been massive problems for years and are actually difficult to sort out because I'm working on AI. So be so wary of that, and let's be in a position where those poor policymakers who are doing the really good work, they're under-resourced, they don't have all the things they need to solve the hardest problems in society that none of these big techs have made any inroads on: health, education, social care. The problems of democracies, or the problems of institutions of government that are not democracies in the developing world. And think about all those things and the people working hard for those who aren't on stage saying, I'm going to fix the world with AI. Because that's where the changes need to be made. And it's going to cost a lot more than the 100 million on a safety institute.
So what should be regulated? How should we regulate? I think the starting point, and I think this came across also in the discussion before, starting point should be AI is not human intelligence. It's nothing close to human intelligence, something fundamentally different. And all these analogies might just lead us in the wrong direction. So people are trying to tell us this is a complete game changer. Therefore, it has to be regulated completely differently from other technology. I don't buy this argument. I think we have to regulate applications of technology. This means regulation has to depend on whether it's a startup reaching 100 customers or a company reaching 100 million customers. I think this is nothing. Of course, the lobbyists are much more powerful. The lobbyists of the large companies are much more powerful than the ones that are in favor of the startups. So that has to be taken into account. And I would say even for these large models that do have applications that have hundreds of millions of users, we could even go a step further and say, actually, in this case, we do want open source. We want access to the source code. Because right now, there's no public scrutiny on this kind of technological artifacts. So I would say open source is a good thing. We don't want to regulate away open source efforts. On the contrary, we want to make sure there's more open source, especially in applications that have a high reach and a high potential impact.
Great. Well, sadly, we've run out of time. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their contributions. And thank you again to the AI House, and in particular to colleagues Hannah, Dia, and Alex at ETH who helped pull this session together. I think there's still a few minutes left to enjoy lunch. Thank you.
Thank you so much.